Hello and welcome to the Position 6 podcast. My name is Dan Offen, aka Mr. Big Jams. In this show, I get to know people involved in the Dota 2 scene, talking about everything Dota related, aside from the rapid clicking of a mouse at a screen. My first episode featured PPD and my second Insania from Team Alliance, and you can go back to check those out now. The Insania episode hasn't picked up quite as many listens as it deserves, which is a shame as I think he's got a lot of really interesting things to say, so do go back to check that out if you haven't. This week's episode is of Jack Chen, aka KBBQ, who's the manager of Forward Gaming and a Dota personality in his own right. After making his name as a broadcaster and translator, Jack has moved into team management and helped to guide VTJ Storm into a top 8 finish at the International 8, and has now transferred most of the squad across to a new organisation. I was really looking forward to speaking to him, and the upcoming interview has justified my excitement. Forward Gaming have just moved into a team house, and I'm really appreciative of him taking the time to talk to me in this busy time. From the sounds of things, the house is still being constructed around him, so apologies for the background noise and the occasional edit jumps in this episode. I think the quality of the content should override any annoyance, but we did our best for the environment. The interview will start after this song. So has everybody moved into the house now?
Not everyone's here just yet. Ali had a family vacation that he planned before, so he'll be here in a few days. And then our situation is a little uncertain because he had to get his visa for Hamburg. For the German visa, he has to go to his local consulate, so he can't come to New York until that's settled, so we're not sure when exactly that's going to be.
Is that for ESL 1 then?
Yeah.
Is this what you're mostly doing in team management? Kind of dealing with visas and dealing with all this organizational stuff?
That's a part of it. It can be a little murky, a little nebulous at times. There's this and then like a very human side to things. There's also like bosses and people that you have to be accountable to who have their own kind of perspectives and their own needs. It's nice to actually be able to go to events and try to help people compete and kind of just feel that rush.
Is that why you got involved in team management and stepped away from casting, because you wanted to be part of that process for a team?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is definitely yes. I still miss it at times, and I got to do it a bit last season. I think one thing that was kind of missing there after the first year was just a sense of like you have like a clear target and goal that you're working towards.
Do you think you were missing that when you weren't in a team?
Yeah, a little bit. Like, it's not to say that there wasn't anything to like improve on or work towards, but it was going to events, very tiring and grueling, and like you don't always get like the best either feedback. And at the end of the day, like you're kind of out there building your own brand, kind of doing it for yourself, which is not a bad thing, which is pretty cool in and of itself. But I think with a team, just feeling like you're helping to try and build like a champion, trying to build the best team in the world, being able to do that and like work with people that you already like respect and trust towards something together is rewarding in a different way.
So you stepped into team management a year ago at VTJ Storm, right?
Yeah.
Is it everything you thought it would be, or has team management been an unexpected challenge in ways you didn't think about?
I think one of the major lessons for me is that it's very hard for players and just about everyone in like tier 1.5, tier 2 team because of how the scene is structured. Because TI and some of these big prizes are so important, not just for livelihood, but for defining like a player's worth or their perception. Anyone who's not on a kind of stone cold tier 1 team is going to be, like very incentivized to look for ways to do that, to join that. So we had a situation early in the year where we qualified for a minor, and a few days after we qualified for that minor, actually, one of our players, Ritsu, kind of gotten an offer before left the team. That and like various other incidents, like when we had like rough stretches, like people just generally, it's harder for people to have faith or just keep working together, and they start kind of looking for their own a little bit more, or they start looking for the best situation that gets them to like a tier 1 team or team that has that potential. But that was like a specific feature of like that area of the scene, I would say.
Do you think that's unique to esports?
In some ways, I think because the way Dota is structured, you have this TI that has such a gigantic prize pool that defines so much that doesn't really exist the same way in other esports. So, for instance, in CS, you have like multiple circuits that people play in with like relegation. You don't have a TI, but you have Valve majors as well that offer more prestige and prize. In other leagues and traditional sports, it's not really, especially traditional team sports, it's not really prize pool driven at all. So, yes, people want to win, but there's more stable salaries. Usually, team side has a bit more kind of power and flexibility, or there's some kind of like franchise structure where people can't just do whatever they want. I think those are unique features of the Dota scene. You have such a it's almost like an individual sport type of prize pool system, right? It's almost like a tennis or golf, but it's a team sport. And so players are very empowered because of the lack of, I would say, centralization of stuff. Like Valve doesn't want to run things the way that other companies and developers do. The end result of that is, again, the incentives of these tournaments are huge. Everything, is kind of up in the air, usually after TI. It's hard to make long-term decisions as a player or as a team or, as just about anybody because it's so like unstable. So I think that was something that I came to grips with very immediately with that first VGJ team. The other thing is I feel much more sympathetic towards kind of other managers and other people in that position. I think I'm fortunate in some ways because like I was kind of known in the scene already, so that helped me in interacting with players, or if I had to stand my ground on something, kind of just having that trust already there. But it's a very hard position to be in because what it means is you're caught between the players and the team. And so the team's going to want or demand certain things, and to them, usually you're replaceable in some way, or it's like it's not too hard to just find someone else who can do what you do and get the players ready. And it's hard to like really measure or appreciate the impact that a manager can have. And from the player's perspective, like, got to make the players happy and earn their trust, because if anything happens to that, like, you're not going to be with the team. So you're kind of squeezed between both sides in a sense.
What would you say is the most important lesson that you've had to learn through all of this?
Are you an organization side manager or a player side manager, right? So if you're organization side, you're there regardless of who the players are. You might, as a result of that, you might get more of a say or more autonomy to kind of make decisions, which is a lot of what I had with VGJ. Like they, at some point, they entrusted me with a lot of kind of ability to make these decisions or make these calls when it came to team and roster stuff. Or your player side, and if you're player side, I mean, you're kind of bound to, the group of players, and it does change things a little bit. And ultimately, it's the players that make the roster decisions, but how much autonomy you have also determines like how you evaluate and what kinds of things you screen for.
Was the transition after TI an easy one?
The players that became forward were getting obviously a lot of offers. I think at one point on a sheet that we had listed, there were like 19 different interested organizations to some degree.
Was the plan for the team always to stick together after TI?
No, it was pretty uncertain. Running joke is that players all talk about this, but they don't actually do. But we had one guy who kept saying that he was really considering retiring. A little bit of uncertainty about the roster. I think most of this group wanted to stay together and play, but if that guy retired, then things would look very different. Ultimately, we decided to make just kind of one change, and it was not an easy decision, and you always lose something in that as well. So, but yeah, after that, we decided to stay together more or less. I decided to stay with the players because of just all that uncertainty and just not really knowing what the direction was going to be. And I felt that I had done my part more or less to say like, hey, here are our options. Like, here's what we can do for next season. And I also made a decision where I said, I want to be part of a like high tier, very strong competitive team. I want to, especially this group that I believe in so much. I want to, finish like, or not even finish, like I keep working with them to try to reach the top. Just because like of the first year showed me kind of how hard it can be when you're kind of just, finding different rosters and different groups of people.
Do you think this team sticking together is a big advantage for them?
I think it is. I think continuity is pretty tricky. People always tend to assume that the longer you're together, the better things would be. Just that's like kind of like a basic logic, but it's not really. It's often not really that true in Dota. I think teams, rosters, group dynamics do have a certain expiration date to them. So I think a lot of teams, like, they come together and they do surprisingly well. And I think the reason for that is they're still in like the honeymoon phase, right? It's like, no one's really sick of each other yet. No one's like really kind of learned each other's strengths and weaknesses. Like, no one's really had a chance to, get on each other's nerves or start finding things that can possibly tear things apart. That there's just like a part of human nature to work in such intensity, like such an intense teamwork environment. But then it comes down to the types of personalities you have, right, for like long term. So you want people who have an edge, who can fundamentally work together, be willing to sacrifice, be forgiving as well, and not like just hold on to things, and just kind of be willing to give each other both the respect and distance and space to keep moving forward. So obviously, like, I think we have that group right now. I think, having Universe, like, we looked at him versus like some other players and possibilities. And this guy, he's always been pretty steady and stable, not just as a player, but as a personality. Professional, he does what he's supposed to do. He does not he's not directly involved in any sort of conflict or any toxicity, and so that's something that's that definitely factored into the process.
Is there an identity in terms of style of play or style of player that you were looking at to try and create Forward Gaming as a team? Or is it just a sense of bringing together the best possible players?
That's a good question. I think usually this sort of process, if done right, starts with the captain, because the captain, he sets the tone and he's the magnet for the other guys on the team. If you have a captain that is amazing, but people don't trust in or don't believe in or anything like that, it kind of doesn't matter. But if you have a captain that people do trust and respect, like SVG, then you can always get quality players who want to play with him and who mesh well with him as well. So I thought it was the first step. But for Universe specifically, after we decided that we were going to make a change with snaking, it was kind of, what parts of snaking did we like and not like? Like, how do we replace, or should we even try to replace the great things that he brought to the team? So snaking is very competitive. He's very intense. He has a lot of very unique and interesting ideas. He's very strong-willed, and he's someone who will never let a team or a group of people just become like fully comfortable, because he's very intense. So for us, it was just like, okay, that's valuable. If we lose that, what are we going to bring in to replace it? Is there someone who is very similar to him? If not, what are the things that we liked and disliked? So it was a very exhaustive process, and we talked to a number of people, and we just kind of asked them a lot of things about fit in game, outside of game. So just thinking about like, how does this person fit the culture? Do we think this person carries themselves in the right way? Does this person create conflicts? Or you kind of put together like a psychological profile, if you can, of this person of your candidates from like as many sources as possible, which is something that that I kind of took part in, and other players too. And then you think about fit in game. So snaking was someone who would take a lot of resources. Like, he would ask for a good amount of like kind of attention. Sometimes he would take over and carry games like that, but sometimes there just aren't enough resources to go around. So maybe you need somebody who plays a little bit differently, or can be sacked a little bit, or doesn't require as much attention during the draft to be at their best. That's another question to weigh, right? It's like a lot of players can be flexible, but what makes them perform at their best? What conditions need to exist for that? So all those things had to be considered, and a lot of times the answers to these things are just like, they're very much based on feel and intuition and kind of talking to people versus like just very empirical observation. So it's not a perfect process by any means, but ultimately we came away thinking that Universe, in terms of what he brings to the team, experience and culture and leadership wise, in his own way, in addition to how he plays and how he communicates. Like, we talked to Aoi, his coach on Fnatic, who's now our coach, to get a deeper look at all these things, and we decided that he was the best choice.
Universe is 29, which makes him probably one of the oldest players in the scene. Is that a concern? Or do you have the confidence that he can keep on going because Fear was 24, 25 when people started calling him an old man. And Universe is a little bit north of that. A lot of people have told me that age isn't really a factor, but you see players drop off all the time. Is that something you won't think? I don't want you to speak of his plans or anything, but is that something you think won't happen to him?
I mean, I think there's a reason that he's been at every TI, right? He's still very consistent. He's still got amazing work ethic. I think the age thing, I mean, it's a little hard to say, because I don't think that sort of decline has been as apparent at times. It also maybe depends on like what position you play. Yeah, I think it's something that's probably been in the back of people's minds in the last few seasons. Like, he hasn't had the same sterling results, but a lot of that is really just kind of fit and team environment, and so it's very easy for people to kind of to say that and say like, his results have dropped off. Like, maybe he's just a little too old for the game. But we certainly don't think so, and it's just very hard to assess. Like, if you have a good fit, if you have good communication, if you have a good culture, I think that makes up for a lot of whatever individual issues, even if they exist.
Were the team pleased with how the international had gone?
Yeah, I think in general, I think if you told us coming into TI we'd have a great group stage and we'd finish was like top 8. From like a big picture view, we'd have been pretty happy with on our own kind of expectations and our own like trajectory. Ultimately, though, obviously, like to lose some of the games the way we did, we had really big leads, and then to have this thing where our first choice was OG or LGD, and then to have that game against Secret where we had like a really big lead. It's always sad to go out feeling like like you weren't really outclassed or people weren't just outright better than you, that you could have maybe beat yourself a little bit. So it's always a bit of regret that comes with that, but I think generally like no one has any hang-ups or real nightmares about TI. I think given all the circumstances, all things that happened, I think it was pretty solid.
That's what it seems, because I suppose at the time there was probably a lot of disappointment about going out, but when you look back, top 8 seems to be what most teams will almost aim for. People go into TI going, as long as we get top 8, we're happy with that, and that's a good space to be, I think.
So many things can happen at TI that can either derail a team or prove to be real issues. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of expectations. There's just everyone's just under a lot of stress. So in some ways, like people view it as like a you don't want to take it too seriously to put more pressure on yourself. You just want to go without too many expectations. And end of the day, like top 8 is I think a career best finish for all the guys except Resolution. So it's something that they can be proud of and build on, and it's viewed in that way instead of something where it's like it was a win or bust type of thing, or they expected to win and we weren't able to do that. But I think it was a really valuable experience, and I think people proved to themselves that they absolutely can compete very successfully at the highest level, and that's really important.
That's good. And how do you think the team's doing now with the new incarnation? Obviously, it's not been hugely tested yet. You've only really just moved together properly as an organization, but you've already qualified for a major, which is quite impressive. Are you pleased with how the season started off?
I think so. Making the major was obviously real big. We've got some events coming up. Like we'll be playing in King's Cup in a few days.
Okay.
And obviously Hamburg, so just a lot more tests. I think it's really hard to say till the LAN results come out, but I think based on the games and matches I've seen, like everything feels pretty good, and it feels like we have a lot of room to grow, and that we have like the right mindset for that. And you can't really ask for more than that. There's so much volatility, and like one or two results. Like you don't want to be a type of team that gets shaken by one or two results, or maybe can't learn to lose or learn from losing in practice or scrims. You don't want to be a team that puts too much of that expectation on yourself, I think. At the same time, like because of the pedigree of the guys that we have, and building forward, and again bring in like a TI champion, like things are definitely we're going to expect more of ourselves.
Do you see these upcoming tournaments like ESL One even and King's Cup? Do you see them as practice for the major, or are they as important in of themselves?
They're important in of themselves. I think for King's Cup we'll be going in a little cold, so to speak. But we've had a couple days to practice, because when you're on the outside, like looking at the games, you're always wondering, like, is the team saving strats? Is the team like kind of just treating it as practice? I think there are very few events or competitions that the team competes in that's kind of in that way. Just because like people are so competitive. Like once they're actually in the games, and you can't have like one or two people not on the same page, or like not trying as hard, because that will be noticeable, and like that could very easily just like lead to dissent or just people getting upset. So I think the safest way to deal with that is just look, you're just going full throttle and competing your hardest all the time. And it's like once we get into a match and an official, like we're gonna give our best. That's just how it is. So in a sense that yes, if we don't do well at King's Cup or Hamburg, it's not going to be the end of the world. But they're very important tournaments to us, and that's why we're boot camping for Hamburg, which some of the teams that are going are not even necessarily doing at this point. So we take it very seriously, and it's just it's your first land together as a team. Like you want a good start to the season, a lot of good competition, a lot of things to be learned that help with Malaysia as well. So we got to be at our best form to make use of that.
We're relatively early into the season. We're not yet at a point where you can definitely say who are the strong teams and who are the weak teams. But is there anyone that you're afraid of? Anyone that you think looks particularly strong so far?
It's a little hard to say, but I think most of the time you can kind of tell. We practicing a little bit with EG leading up to TI. Like, I thought, hey, they're probably going to be pretty good. Like, they're going to figure things out eventually. So they're definitely a very strong team. We expect like VP and we expect Liquid to recover and still be like very threatening teams. I think China is probably going to produce some surprisingly good teams. I think the shakeup is going to be very helpful for them because I think there's always been a bit of a bottleneck for young talent, and occasionally it comes up and you see these like Serenities and other teams that use like that have relatively unknown players start to do very well. And it's because I think with the right mix, with the right opportunity, that's all a lot of these really talented young players need. So I think with how the Chinese scene is so dispersed this season, I think you're going to see a lot of promising young players get a chance.
That's exciting. I wanted to talk a little bit about China, actually. What do you think happened? Is it just that there was too much of the old guard at this TI that caused China a little bit of issues? Is there anything that you think went wrong for China at this international?
So basically, leading up to TI, like Chinese teams started scrimming immediately after qualifiers. They go pretty hard. So maybe they're a little burned out, or it was too much even. But basically, they have their own meta and they have their own practice environment because like they're all playing each other nonstop for like 3-4 weeks before they get to Vancouver. When they were in Vancouver, so we scrimmed LGD and we did pretty well against them. And so we like LGD doesn't seem that good. What's going on? And then we heard all the other Chinese teams talking about how great LGD was.
Okay.
So that was kind of our inkling that we're like, oh, maybe China isn't that strong this year because they all think LGD is amazing. But we did very well against them. That was kind of our first inkling, and then LGD is a team. I mean, they learned incredibly quickly. They stumbled out of the gate a little bit in the group stage, but once they kind of learned and adapted, they showed that they're just a very solid team. And I remember talking to their coach QQ at some point about kind of practice and lead up to TI, and he's like, yeah, we weren't really sure what was actually good or not because we won scrim with just about everything we tried, so we couldn't properly evaluate our strategies or our plans.
Fair enough. Do you think I want to talk a little bit, there's two parts in that I kind of want to talk about. Firstly, about his involvement, because he was a coach and he's also quite a high profile coach. You've gone with Aoi as a coach for some time. Do you think coaching is now a particularly important part of Dota?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. I think it right now, just in general, it's really hard to find someone is settled on wanting to be a coach, working on that, and that's currently what Aoi wants. So that's just great for us because a lot of people they coach, they've kind of like a foot in the door, still wanting to play or other aspirations, or it's like a pit stop for them. But to find someone who's dedicated to that craft and like coaching is hard because there's no like experience or degrees or like years of like working within an organization. You kind of just need the trust of the players and the respect of the players. So it's very hard to find someone who meets both those criteria, and so that's why I think someone like Aoi is great for it. I think someone, these Chinese coaches, they've all had high level playing experience, and in a lot of cases they're paid or even compensated better than the players. So it's very important. But at the same time, you don't want someone who's so entrenched or so set that like, they can't really look honestly at themselves, or, like that syndrome is an issue as well. I think it's something that Chinese teams have faced too, where you maybe can't move a guy or you can't really motivate or, put a fire under someone. You don't want that to happen either. And I don't think that's going to be the case for someone like Aoi, who's extremely detail oriented and just, treats the game as just like a real playground for the mind, I guess.
Yeah. Is there any chance you'd want Aoi or another coach to move to doing what the LGD coach was doing, i.e. drafting for the team and almost setting the tone and tempo of what the team should be doing?
It's a possibility, but every team's pretty different. The draft is always just like a really hard spot to deal with because there's just so many ideas. Like sometimes you almost want people to have fewer ideas there so that you can be more on the same page. Like the draft is always the easiest thing to blame when you're not doing well. It's always the easiest thing to hindsight, and everyone's got like such a different perspective on it. So it really depends from team to team. I think if you have a situation where the captain and the coach are essentially on the same page with philosophy or picks, then that's something that's probably doable. I'm not sure how that's going to be for us going forward. I think that's still something we got to figure out.
I think what's interesting, though, is having such a high profile, such a domineering coach takes a lot of pressure off the players. What I've always been struck with in esports, and I'm interested to know how much you agree with this, is that unlike normal sports, there's an undue amount of pressure placed on players because they have to often decide who they play with. They have to take part of all of the elements of how a team, strategic element of a team, whereas a soccer team or an American football team, all that's decided by people off the pitch. So do you think high-profile coaches allow that? Do you think that pressure is a big issue for players, or do you think it actually adds something?
That's a good question, because ROTK himself, I take a lot of pressure off the team because he's like doing the drafting and stuff. So if they get blamed for, he can just become the lightning rod as like the strategic guy in that sense. There's different kinds of coaches. Some people are, more detail oriented, more about say like lanes or tactics or finding small edges and efficiencies, or good at individual development. Some are more big picture, kind of strategic game plan, and some are more going to be wanting to kind of impose their ideas as as kind of proof of concept, or to like show that they're what they say is like correct. And some are going to be more better for like say either emotional support or keeping everybody setting a good tone for everyone, and helping people grow individually. So it's all different. I think every team's needs are going to be very different too, because sometimes you have very domineering captains who, it's my way or the highway type of thing. They're going to lead to a certain type of coach, and then sometimes you have people who are a little different. So it very much depends. It's just such a puzzle all the time, no matter what the team is.
Do you think there's a development to be done there? Because esports is such a young medium, such a young sport, that the changes in traditional sports over the past 10 years, over the past 50 years are gigantic, whereas esports, there's still a lot to be done. Is there any prediction you'd make in terms of the way it will go eventually, or do you think we're there? Do you think not as many changes as I imply will actually be made?
I think there will be. I think players have so much autonomy and power, and even if it's like, say, long term for the best of the players, but something the players don't agree with or don't like it's going to be very hard to push that through. So there's always this intricate balance there. At the same time, people are going to be constantly looking for edges, whether it's analytics tools to help coaches and players, whether it's more on the personal front in terms of whether it's sports psychology or some kind of therapy, nutrition, all those types of things. They're all things that people are going to look at to make strides and improvements in. And that's something that we're also very actively going to be looking at this season.
That's one of the things that I kept on saying during this international this year, that some of these players very clearly need sports psychologists. Is that going to be a big part of your philosophy for building a team, that players need that support and can't do it by themselves anymore?
Ideally, like something that I would want my players to have. So yeah, in that sense, it's something that I push for, having the resources available, if not just a fully a sports psychologist, because I think the coach and even myself to some extent do some of that. It's just having the resources available so you can go and get someone to help you in that way if people believe that it's a good idea. But beyond that, I think there's certain other things, like maintaining physical health, sleep schedule. If they need someone to talk to, like that's another plus. Just finding ways to either gain an edge or accelerate their training or change the conditions of their training. All that stuff I think is pretty important. And we're going to be moving in that direction this season for sure.
Is there any particular reason you went with Forward Gaming as an organization? Because it's not an organization that, as far as I'm aware, has worked in Dota before. So is there anything that was exciting about their offer as opposed to the offers of different teams?
The main thing that it came down to is that they were willing to offer us an East Coast team house, in a sense of of our choosing or selection that fit our needs. I think that was probably the biggest factor, being like similar or at a competitive rate to the other offers. Some of these other teams, they have like very established bases in in either Texas or Los Angeles, which comes with its own advantages because they already have a lot of the support staff. You're part of like this kind of hive. Like it's better in terms of like being connected and being part of like a big structure. There's pros and cons that come with that, but at the end of the day, we want it to be East Coast. It allows us to regularly practice and pub in Europe if we so choose, without like massive delay or ping issues. And that was something that was really important to us that we identified, that was helpful for us last season. So at the end of the day, that's the main thing that it came down to, with all of the things either equal or better to the other offers that we received. So, well, they're a bit of an unknown. They're just a bit risky, maybe in some ways, not really knowing them, not having that history. But that's another one of those things that can be a pro or a con. If you're just one team, part of a beehive of teams and stuff like that, you'll get treated a certain way that may or may not be better or worse. You're part of kind of like a structure, versus with a relatively new team and structure, like there's a certain level of independence and trust that must exist there. And so some of the things that we felt worked for us last season, like again, a relative independence, a good amount of kind of trust and familiarity with the organization, and then being on the East Coast, those were things that we valued this year coming into this process. And ultimately, Forward was in the best position to be able to offer those things.
In terms of the schedules that you're going to be expecting to compete on, something I talked about with PPD quite a lot is that there's a very punishing schedule of being part of a professional team. Is this team going to be aiming to compete in every single tournament? Is they going to be aiming to go hell for leather up until TI, or is that a concern that you don't necessarily want to do that?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. It can be a very punishing schedule, and we this Vegas event, we kind of decided not to. There's a Red Bull event coming up that partly due to visa reasons, but we also didn't want to just add too much. So we want to be able to be more selectively discerning about what we play in. Obviously, you want to play in the big tournaments, you want to do all the DPC stuff, but we want to make sure that we have time to have some kind of balance and actually prepare for the tournaments that we're going to play in. We don't want to just kind of jump into stuff to jump into stuff. Yeah, it is going to be an issue because, well, just to give you an example of the schedule coming up. So even though we didn't play in Vegas or Red Bull, we play King's Cup, then we go to Hamburg. We come back from Hamburg for about a week, and then we go directly to Malaysia. And we're in Malaysia for 2 weeks. Then we come back, and then the qualifier is about a week after we come back from Malaysia, which is traditionally Thanksgiving time for Americans. So we, the guys won't even get a chance to really go home or anything for Thanksgiving because we have to stay and kind of boot camp and practice for that. And so it almost disadvantages the teams that major, because now you're so tired and drained from competing. You're coming back from a totally different time zone, and you have a week to hop right into the next major qualifier. So it's and it just kind of goes like that nonstop. I think the first half of the year is a little bit less packed as well. You have to figure out which third-party tournaments you want to play. It can be pretty tough, and we want to pace ourselves. We want to be just going full throttle at the start of the year. We've seen a lot of teams that do that, and you kind of just burn out a little bit. We want to be very judicious in what we play and how prepared we are.
With that in mind, do you have any thoughts about the changes that Valve have made to the DPC season?
Man, I feel like I could do just a whole episode on DPC. So.
Keep it down to a minute or so.
I think overall it has a lot more order to it and structure to it. I don't agree with all of the changes, and I think that some of them, just if there's just more direct kind of either micromanagement or oversight, I think that would be better.
Okay.
But instead, I think their philosophy is they kind of want something that generally resolves all the big issues but doesn't require constant micromanagement. When it comes to invites and criteria like that, I think they had a choice between, are we just going to micromanage all the invites for all the events instead of allowing organizers to do it, or are we just going to set this broad guideline that more or less works for everybody, and then they'll still retain some ability to make decisions or adjustments for the last few slots. I think that's the choice that they made. So just to draw a parallel, I hope this isn't going too much, but when you have something like a DPC, so the TI is the Everest of esports. It's going to be the most important thing, right? So if you have an objective metric for measuring teams getting into TI, there's just so many things to control for, because you have to control for things like strength of region, things like available opportunities to compete for DPC points, which was an issue last season. Things like strength of opponents faced, all that stuff has to be controlled for if you want to put an objective metric on it. So let me give you some examples. The first major of last season, I believe, was an 8-team major with 4 European teams, 1 Chinese and 1 NA, right? So you would just say and then if that sets the tone for the invites for the rest of the season, even though those teams did end up deserving it, it's very hard for certain regions in that situation. Like, China placed, I think, 4 out of the top 6 or top 5 at TI, yet they only get 1 spot to the first major. Things like that are very hard to control for. Another example, a newbie goes and they win a 16-team tournament at Genting, like a loaded field. And the DPC points they get for that, because it was kind of ordained to be a minor, was way less than what you would get from winning a major, even though, like, by difficulty or by field, that's probably one of the harder tournaments of the year for a team to win, right? So there's all kinds of stuff like that when you try to have one kind of objective metric. What they do in American sports, for where they have this kind of difficult selection process, and not everyone plays everyone else. So, for instance, college basketball or college football, which are huge sports here stateside, they have a committee, and there are metrics that they use in terms of objective points or things like that. But that's only one part of the decision-making system. So I think something like that, it requires a lot more effort and oversight. But I think something like that is a bit more well-rounded, because you have to assess by region, by strength of tournament. The other thing that does is it makes it so that all tournaments still matter. Instead of just saying, like, you have DPC tournaments that matter for TI and you have non-DPC tournaments that third party can kind of do whatever. I kind of like the part of the old system where it's like all the tournaments mattered. Like, you didn't go in with full transparency, but you also could never be certain, right? And I think that's actually okay. I don't think that there needs to be, like, in the interest of, like, full transparency on having a metric that just shows you everything. I think that there should be some intrigue and some discussion and, like, some level of that decision making being kept there. Because it makes all other tournaments still matter. It still creates those incentives for third party tournaments to have big fields, to have big balanced fields. But at the same time, it doesn't force teams to it doesn't really force the hand with evaluation. So I mean, I know I just said a lot of stuff, and it's like a very major issue to unpack, but I prefer, for organizers too, it's like they can still choose between, are you a tournament that wants to invite the big name teams and players and focus more on that, or are you a tournament that wants to be the most competitively viable? Your tournament will still matter. So yeah, I think in some ways the having qualified great equalizer for because of all the invites and all that drama last year. So I think that is a good fix to part of the issue. Just like, hey, screw it, everyone's got to qualify. You got to prove it every single time. So there's nothing that's like really wrong with that. I just think that there is a slightly better way that requires a lot more direct micromanagement.
It's difficult, though, I imagine, for Valve, because unlike a normal sport, esports is controlled by them, and it's almost marketing esports as for the game as well as its own little thing. So I think transparency has to be really, really important for them. And I think that's a big issue of esports, that controlled by a developer rather than an independent body.
It absolutely is. It's not like basketball doesn't own the sport, right? But you can make like a league. And
like if basketball was owned by Ian Basketball, for example, and he controlled all the rules for basketball and everyone had to buy basketballs off him, I imagine the sport of basketball would be quite different.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's such a wide issue that we could spend like a whole podcast talking about. But yeah, like they have a lot of challenges in that sense. There are certain things that they want and don't want, and for good reason. Everything's going to be very thought out on what they think makes sense and on what they think is worth their time and energy to kind of directly like regulate or deal with. And so I think, a lot of times like they let people kind of solve their own problems and then step in only when needed. That's been a consistent philosophy that I think we've seen from them, and it can lead to some good organic solutions. So yeah, you made a really good point as well about the transparency and stuff. It's like a good selling point as well if you have like these points and it's a constant topic of debate and discussion instead of just people don't know, and then it's debate and discussion in its own way, but it's like less presentable because there's no like standings. But I think one thing is that I mentioned this before, is because the prize structure and because of how TI is, you essentially have an individual sports type of incentive structure and like point structure instead of like a team sport one, even though this is a team sport. So I think that's something that would have to be reconciled a bit. It's a lot of it's some large and complicated issues to solve, and it's going to create there's going to be problems with any structure either way, and I think they've obviously done a good job of eliminating a lot of them.
Are we going to see you at a lot of events coming up, or are you going to be focusing mainly on this?
I'll be with the team at every event. So
Okay.
I probably won't be able to mix in like talent stuff like I did last season. When the team didn't make some events or there's some time off or anything like that. I'll probably be with the team the whole season. So.
Thank you for listening to the Position 6 podcast, and a huge thanks to Jack for appearing on it. I think he probably had enough to say to fill several podcasts, and I had a huge grin on my face all episode. Thank you again for all your support so far. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I can be found at Daniel Offen, that's Daniel OFFEN, and it would be a huge help if you were to share and talk about the podcast wherever you can. The bigger audience I can build, the more regular and better guests I can attract. I've been very lucky of the people who've agreed to be on the show so far, and I promise to be in the future, but my luck can't last forever, so I'm eventually going to have to brag to players about my list of numbers, so whatever you can do will hugely help. I'm still planning on releasing new episodes every week, but I don't have a 100% confirmed guest for next week. I'm hoping it'll be a member of J-Storm, though I've yet to nail down an exact recording date or aside from sometime this week. I'm hoping to get a few members of Forward Gaming on the show too once everything's settled down for them a little, and I'll leave a little bit of a break between episodes on the same team obviously. I've got Seb/7 Ucking Mad coming up in a few weeks, though I don't have an exact recording date, but that will be out in about a month I hope. Aside from that, I'm still looking for guests, so do get in touch if you're a member or a manager of a team that's attending LANs and bigger online events. If you'd like to suggest anything for the show or offer any feedback or comments, please get in touch over Twitter or email. This is still a new format, and I'd love to help create something with the community that will be here for years, and I can't really do it just by myself off my own back, so I really would actually genuinely appreciate what people think of the show. I'll be putting it on YouTube shortly, which is something that a few people have requested, and I'll probably have some few other content ideas up there as well when I get around to filming them. So check that out when it arrives. Once again, I appear on another podcast called Faking Lit, which you can find on all good podcast platforms. It's a lot of fun. It's a bit of an improv show about books, and we're in the middle of a Harry Potter series, so check that out if you'd like to see a slightly lighter side to me. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.